Right now, everyone is watching Alex Eala. Every headline, every prediction, every conversation about the US Open keeps circling back to her name. She is being talked about like a player who is finally ready to break through on the biggest stage tennis has to offer. But rewind just a few weeks, and that same name meant something completely different. In Cincinnati, Eala walked off the court after a loss that nobody expected, the kind of result that makes people quietly start questioning a player right before the tournament that matters most. Fans went silent. Analysts started asking uncomfortable questions. For a moment, it looked like the timing could not have been worse. So here is the question you need to sit with for the next 20 minutes. How does a player go from a result that shook her confidence in Cincinnati to being one of the most hyped names heading into New York in the span of just a few weeks? That gap should not exist, not this fast, not after a loss like that. And yet here we are, watching her name trend for all the right reasons. Right before the tournament, everyone said she needed to prove herself in. I am not going to tell you the answer yet, because the answer only makes sense once you understand what actually happened in between. What she lost in Cincinnati, what almost broke, and what changed so completely that it turned a heartbreak into the exact thing fueling the hype you are seeing right now. This is not a story about one bad match. This is a story about what a player does after one bad match, when everyone is watching to see if she folds. To understand how she got from that low point to this one, we have to go back further than Cincinnati. We have to start at the very beginning, back when nobody was watching her at all, and there was no guarantee any of this would ever happen. Before Eala was a name people debated on tennis broadcasts, she was just a kid inside a system built to produce exactly one outcome: results. She came up through the IMG Academy pipeline, a place that takes in hundreds of promising juniors every year and sends out only a handful who actually make it to the tour. That number matters. Most players who walk through those doors never make it this far. The odds were never in her favor just by being there. Talent gets you a seat at the table. It does not guarantee you get to keep it. For years, Eala had to prove herself over and over. In tournaments most casual fans never watched, on courts with no cameras and no crowds. There was no headline for the moments when she lost early and had to fly home wondering if the next tournament would be different. There was no story written about the nights she had to trust a process that was not giving her any proof it was working yet. That is the part people forget when they see a name suddenly everywhere. They assume the rise was fast. It never is. Her breakthrough at the Miami Open changed the way people saw her almost overnight. She beat ranked opponents in front of crowds that showed up to watch someone else, and by the end of that tournament, they were chanting her name instead. That was the moment casual fans finally learned who she was. But here is what most people missed. That breakthrough did not erase the pressure. It multiplied it. Once you break through, you stop being the surprise. You become the expectation. Every match after that carries a different weight, because now people assume you are supposed to win. The tennis world does not ask where you came from anymore. It only asks what you do next. That shift is brutal, and it is rarely talked about. The same moment that makes a career also makes the pressure heavier, because now there is something real to lose. So by the time Eala walked into Cincinnati, she was not just playing a tournament. She was playing under the weight of every expectation that came with everything she had already built. One good result away from being called the future of the sport. One bad result away from every headline questioning whether Miami was a fluke. That is the version of Eala who stepped onto the court that day. Not a struggling junior anymore. Not an unproven name. A player with something real to defend, in front of people who were finally paying attention. Which is exactly why what happened next hit as hard as it did. Before we go there, I want you to sit with this question for a second. Have you ever had a moment where succeeding at something actually made the pressure worse, not better? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think more people understand this feeling than they realize, and I want to hear your story before we get into hers. Because what came next did not just test her game, it tested everything she had built up to that point. And for a moment, It looked like it might break her. Cincinnati was not just a loss on a scoreboard. It was the moment every piece of pressure she had been carrying finally caught up with her at once. Watch that match closely, and you can see it happening in real time. Early in the first set, she is still playing her game, still taking risks, still looking like the player who broke through in Miami. Then, something shifts. The errors start creeping in on shots she would normally make without thinking. The kind of misses that do not come from a lack of skill. They come from a mind that is somewhere else. By the second set, it was not really about tennis anymore. It was about a player trying to fight her way out of her own head in front of an audience that had only just started believing in her. Here is the part that makes it worse. This was not an isolated bad day. If you look at the weeks leading into Cincinnati, the signs were already there. Longer points than usual, where she used to close things out quickly. Body language that read more tired than focused. A player who looked like she was running on the momentum of Miami instead of the form that created it. So ask yourself this. If the warning signs were building for weeks, why did nobody see this coming? That is the first layer of this problem. But it gets more complicated. Because after Cincinnati, something else started happening that had nothing to do with the scoreboard. The conversation around her began to shift. Fans who had celebrated her breakthrough just weeks earlier started asking if Miami was a one-time thing. Analysts who praised her aggressive game began questioning whether that same aggression was actually the problem, whether she needed to slow down and play safer tennis instead. That is a brutal position for any young player to be in. The exact style that made her exciting was suddenly being framed as her weakness. Now here is the second question worth sitting with. If the aggressive game that built her career was suddenly being called reckless, was the problem really her game itself, or was it something happening underneath the surface that had nothing to do with tactics at all? Because here is what almost nobody was talking about at the time. A young player who breaks through fast rarely gets time to process what just happened to her life before the next tournament starts. There is no pause button. The schedule does not wait for you to catch your breath. It just keeps coming, one big moment after another, whether you are ready or not. So by the time Cincinnati ended, Eala was not just dealing with one bad loss. She was dealing with the accumulated weight of a season that had asked more of her, faster, than most players her age are ever asked to handle. And here is where it starts to look genuinely uncertain. Because with the US Open just weeks away, there was no time to quietly regroup. No off-season to reset. Just an immediate next test, on an even bigger stage, with even more attention on her than before. At that point, even the people closest to her were not sure what version of Eala was going to show up in New York. The confident player from Miami, or the player who had just unraveled in Cincinnati. Nobody knew. And for a moment, it genuinely looked like this story might not have a comeback in it at all. Here is where everyone got the story wrong. Most people assumed that if Eala was going to turn this around, it would show up first on the court. A big win. A statement match. Something visible that proved she had fixed whatever broke in Cincinnati. That is not what happened. And that is exactly why almost nobody saw this coming. The real turning point had nothing to do with tactics. It was not a new serve motion or a coaching change or some tactical adjustment breakdown analysts love to talk about. The shift happened somewhere much quieter. It happened in how she talked about what went wrong. Instead of treating Cincinnati as proof that something was broken, she started treating it as information. Not a verdict on who she was as a player, but a signal about what her body and her mind needed heading into the next stretch of the season. That distinction sounds small. It is not. It is the difference between a player who spirals after a loss and a player who studies it. Think about the assumption everyone walked into this story with. The assumption that a breakthrough player who suddenly struggles must be regressing, must be losing whatever made her special in the first place. That assumption feels obvious. It also happens to be wrong. Almost every single time you actually look closely at players who go on to have long careers. Here is the analogy that makes this click. Think about a bridge under construction. Right before it can hold real weight, engineers deliberately stress test it, pushing it right to the edge of failure, not because they wanted to break, but because that is the only way to find out exactly where the weak points are before it truly matters. Cincinnati did that to Eala. It found the exact pressure points nobody could see from the outside, the ones that never would have surfaced during a comfortable win. That is not weakness. That is data. And what she did with that data is the actual turning point of this story. Rather than trying to erase what happened in Cincinnati, her team used it. They identified exactly where the pressure was breaking her focus, and instead of changing her game, they changed how she prepared her mind to carry that pressure without letting it hijack her shots. The aggressive game stayed. The panic underneath it did not. This is the part that should genuinely surprise you. The player walking into the US Open right now is not a fixed version of the player who lost in Cincinnati. She is a tested version. The kind of tested that only comes from actually breaking a little and finding out what is on the other side of it. If you have been with me this far, I want to know something honestly. Before this video, did you assume Cincinnati was a setback, or secretly did some part of you wonder if it might turn out to be exactly what she needed? Be honest in the comments, because I think a lot of you had a feeling about this before I even said it out loud, and I want to see how many of you called it early. Because knowing that a mental shift happened is one thing, seeing the actual proof that it worked is a completely different level of confirmation. And that proof is not subtle. Once you see it laid out, you will understand exactly why the hype heading into New York is not hype at all. It is earned. If you are still not fully convinced this shift was real, that is fair. So let's stop talking about what changed and look at what actually happened afterward. Because the proof is not hidden. It is sitting right there in how she has competed since Cincinnati. Start with the way she has approached matches in the weeks since. Watch her closely, and you will notice something different in the pressure points, the moments that used to be where things unraveled. The long rallies, the tight second sets. Those are exactly the situations where Cincinnati exposed her, and those are exactly the situations where she has started closing points out again instead of drifting into them. That is not random. That is a player who identified her exact breaking point and trained specifically to reinforce it. Now look at how she is talking about the tournament itself. Compare her tone now to the tone right after Cincinnati. Right after that loss, the language was careful, guarded, the kind of talk from a player still trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Listen to her now, and the language has shifted into something calmer, more direct, the kind of confidence that does not come from forcing positivity. It comes from someone who has already tested the worst version of the pressure and knows she can carry it. Here is the third piece, and this is the detail almost nobody has connected yet. Look at who has been talking about her differently in the weeks leading into New York. Not just fans, players, coaches. The kind of people inside the sport who do not hand out praise casually, and who watched Cincinnati as closely as anyone. If Cincinnati had actually been a sign of real decline, that group would be cautious right now, hedging their expectations. They are not. If anything, the opposite has happened. The tone from inside the sport has gotten more confident, not less. And that shift only happens when the people closest to a player have seen something real behind the scenes that the public has not fully seen yet. Put those three pieces together. A visible change in how she handles the exact pressure points that broke her in Cincinnati. A tone shift in how she talks about herself, from convincing to certain. And a shift in how the people inside tennis are talking about her, moving toward confidence instead of caution. That is not hype built on nothing, that is hype built on evidence, even if most people watching from the outside have not stopped to actually look for it. So let's go back to where we started. The question at the beginning of this video was simple. How does a player go from heartbreak in Cincinnati to genuine hype heading into New York in just a few weeks? By now, that question does not feel like a mystery anymore. Because once you see what that loss actually revealed, and what she chose to do with it, the transformation stops looking sudden. It starts looking earned, one deliberate step at a time, which means the real question left is not how she got here, It is what she does now that she has arrived. So what does all of this actually mean for Eala walking into the US Open? It means the story you thought you knew, the one where a promising player stumbled right before the biggest stage of her career, was never the real story at all. The real story is about what happens after the stumble, when nobody is watching for the recovery, when there is no highlight reel for the quiet work that actually rebuilds a player from the inside out. And this is bigger than one tournament for one player. Because what Eala went through in those few weeks between Cincinnati and New York is something almost every young athlete who breaks through early eventually faces. The moment where the pressure of what you already built becomes heavier than the challenge of building it in the first place. Most stories treat that moment as the end of a rise. Hers is turning into proof that it can be the middle of one. So here is where this leaves us. Eala walks into the US Open now, not as an unproven breakthrough player anymore, and not as someone still trying to recover from Cincinnati either. She walks in as someone who has already been tested in the exact way this tournament is going to test her, and who came out the other side with real answers instead of just hope. Whether that translates into results in New York is still an open question. Nobody gets to skip that part. But if you understand everything that happened in these past few weeks, you understand why so many people inside the sport are not treating this as a gamble anymore. They are treating it as a player who finally has the full picture of what she is capable of carrying. That is where her story stands right now. Not finished, not fully proven yet either, just genuinely, for the first time in a while, pointed in a direction worth watching closely. So tell me, after everything we just walked through, do you think Cincinnati ends up being remembered as the moment that almost derailed her? Or the moment that quietly made everything after it possible? I want to know where you land, and if you want to see exactly how this story continues once she steps onto that court in New York, make sure you are subscribed, because I am not walking away from this one. The next chapter is coming, and after everything you just learned about how she got here, you are not going to want to find out what happens next from someone else.